welcome back to this month's episode of Healthy Living Resources. This month we're going to be discussing having difficult family conversations, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Healthy Living Resources. This month we're joined by Alisha Barton, Miami County Extension Educator. Welcome, Alicia. So before we jump into today's topic, tell our viewers just a little bit about yourself and the work that you do in Miami County.
Okay, so I am a family consumer science educator in Miami County, which is just north of Dayton. I teach a lot of healthy people classes, such as dining with diabetes. I teach some cooking classes at our rec centers and with our adults with disabilities. So lots of cooking in Miami County.
Okay.
I enjoy that personally. It's kind of one of my hobbies. So, and then personally, since we are talking today about difficult conversations with your kids, I am also a mom of 4 daughters, all girls, and my oldest is 19. Well, she'll be 19 on Saturday, and then my youngest is 10. So
excellent. Okay, so let's dive right in because we have a lot to cover today. So tell us about what it means having difficult conversations within the family.
Okay, well, this is one of the toughest jobs we have as a parent, having these difficult conversations. They can be, hard for teenagers to talk about, hard for us as parents to bring up, and we know that our kids are being exposed to these. We're in a 24-hour news world where they're getting notifications on their phone, they're on social media, and so even little kids are exposed to serious stories and serious topics on a fairly regular basis. So it's important as parents that we face this challenge head on, and that we don't wait for our kids to come to us, but that we, are prepared to have these conversations. Yeah. And these can be topics or conversations that are embarrassing, upsetting, maybe even controversial. And sometimes we don't even know these subjects are going to be tough for us or our kids until they come up.
Right.
And then we realize, there's a little bit of controversy here. We have some disagreements on, what we think versus what our kids think.
Right.
And there, it can be a variety of topics. They can be talking about money, talking about sex, talking about underage drinking, talking about social media, or even our kids' plans after high school.
Wow. I wouldn't have considered the last one a difficult conversation, but I guess it depends on what direction they're going in.
Right.
And it could be. So give us some advice on how we can manage these conversations. How do we go about doing that?
All right. So first of all, keep in mind there is no set script for these conversations. It can be there's not one way that it has to be done. So kind of be open to some different possibilities of how this could happen and what you can say, because there's just no script for these.
Right.
So it's a good idea to think about these topics before your kids ask. So my experience as a mom is they never wait until I'm completely prepared, focused, not distracted to bring me their strange or tough questions.
Right.
They like to drop those bombs when I'm busy or distracted or doing something else that's really important, and then that's when they come to me and they say, oh, by the way, or ask me a tough question.
Right.
So be prepared. Start thinking about some of these things, especially the ones that maybe you're more concerned about or the conversations that you're wanting to have with your kids. Start thinking about what are some things you could say. What can I say to my kids when they come and ask me questions about sexting or about alcohol or about my vaping, for example. You can kind of work out a few key points as a parent before they come to you, and then you can even practice them. So this is some advice sometimes I give parents in my parenting classes, kind of practice your responses so that they're a little bit more natural, especially if you tend to overreact. You can kind of practice your responses and temper them and be prepared.
Right, because if you're responding from a point of stress or even shock, it's not going to probably make them feel comfortable wanting to continue with the conversation or maybe bring other stuff to you in the future.
Correct.
But if you're not prepared, it is kind of a really human jarring moment of what did they just ask me?
Exactly. And keep in mind too, though, you can say, I'm very surprised by this, or this is very shocking to me, or I don't know very much about this. I need a minute.
Yeah,
so,
which is fair.
Right. There was a couple weeks ago where my daughter came home to me and said that somebody had requested that she send them a naked picture. And I was kind of okay, I'll be right back, because I just had not really considered that I knew this friend, and I had not considered that this friend was someone that would make that request of her.
Right.
And so not only was I surprised that we had friends like this in our life, but I was also surprised that someone had made that request of my daughter. So I needed just a minute to kind of fix my own mind, to not overreact and be
thoughtfully respond, not lash out or So it feels like these kinds of conversations, like we're talking about some specific conversations today, but difficult conversations in general can probably happen whenever. Obviously, your kid. I even like Santa, right? My nephew, I was giving him a bath, and he's like, "How does Santa do it?" And I was just like, "Oh, I don't know the answer to this question." You know what I mean? So but the other conversations that we're talking about, when do you really start getting into that? When's a good time to start having those conversations?
So some of the topics, really, whenever it's relevant for your family, is a good time to have that conversation. And as a parent, it's up to you to make that decision. There are some guidelines you can find online. The American Pediatrics Academy of Pediatrics will have some guidelines on when you introduce topics such as sex and where babies come from and things like that. But really, whenever these are relevant to your family, you're going to want to bring them up to your kids. So 8 or 9 is typically a time when our kids are starting to change, and maybe they're noticing some changes in their own bodies. That may be a good time to bring up topics such as what's happening to their bodies and what happens with puberty, et cetera. But if they're exposed to, somebody was telling me recently that in their community there was a child family that was injured in an accident with a drunk driver, and so they had to talk to their kids about drinking. That was something their kids were not familiar with. And so if it's relevant to your family, you're going to want to bring it up and talk to your kids about it.
So there's no right or wrong. How would you respond if a younger kid maybe asks about a topic that is definitely outside of so they're hearing it from other kids, obviously, but how would you respond in that case when maybe going into the full conversation doesn't make sense, or does it? If they ask, do you just go right into it?
We can always share more later. That's something that's important to keep in mind. So share what you're comfortable with now. Keep in mind, though, if your child's coming to you with this question, they heard it from somewhere. So, and especially, some of those big topics, you may want to be the first person to introduce those ideas to your kids. So keep that in mind. If you want to be the first one to talk to your kids about certain things, you're going to probably need to start a little younger so that they're not exposed to those things at school with their peers, etc. So, but when your kids are young and they come to you with those questions, like I said, keep in mind they've heard that from somewhere. So you're going to want to kind of follow up with that. How do you know about this? Where did you hear about this, etc. But another good thing to keep in mind is, like I said, you can share more later. They're often very curious when they're young, and so we do have the benefit of when they're young and they come to you with those questions, they're going to continue to do that when they're young, because their parents are their first line of defense when they hear something that's scary or shocking. So, tell them what you're comfortable with now, and then you can share more later. Of course, what you share with an 8-year-old is going to look different than an 18-year-old. But share what you're comfortable with now, and like I said, follow up on that question. Where did you hear about this? Why is this a concern to you? But also, don't dismiss those concerns. I think you mentioned earlier about we need to take their concerns seriously when they're young. If they come to us when they're 5 and they say, I have a boyfriend, and we freak out and say, no, you don't, because you're only 5, and 5-year-olds don't have boyfriends. You shouldn't even like boys. Sorry, I'm using boys because that's my experience. But with my girls anyway, But if you say, no, that's silly, you don't have a boyfriend, don't worry about boys, they're going to keep that in mind when they're 14. They're going to be less likely to come to you and say, hey, I have a boyfriend. So do take those concerns seriously. You may want to just not share as much as you would if they were older, but take them seriously and share what you're comfortable with.
Which is great, because then you're kind of starting that pattern of them trusting you and being able to come to you, and then they're going to continue to do so. Rather than shutting it down because it's uncomfortable for you to maybe hear that your 5-year-old has a boyfriend, which is probably not, it's whatever, but it'll get them asking those questions further. So give us some tips on how do we actually manage these conversations, like first responses, give us some actual tips on how to get started with this stuff.
Okay, so the first one is consider your reaction, and your first reaction matters. And I know this from reacting positively when my kids have come to me with things and reacting negatively when my kids have come to me with things. But these first reactions do really matter. So you might want to, like I said, if you're shocked, say, I need a minute, I'll get back to you on this. Take a deep breath, maybe leave the room for just a second, but just try to stay calm. If you're shocked by the topic, just reassure your child, I need a minute, but we can talk about this later. And make sure that you follow up, that you're not putting that off for a long time, that you're following up within a reasonable amount of time and having that conversation. Something else you can do is say, I'm happy that you came to me to talk about this. I'm happy that you trust me with this information. Thank you for telling me. That's something I always try to say. It's really hard sometimes that I'm really forcing myself to say it, but I do always try to say, thank you for telling me this. I'll need to talk to you about this more later. I need to, check into some things, and then we can have that conversation. But thank them for being honest with you and for bringing you that question.
Right. I like that you said don't, say I need to come back to this and never come back to this. So I feel like that's one of the biggest things we often hear about the birds and the bees conversations is like most parents never do it. They awkwardly avoid it. I honestly don't think that I ever had that conversation with my parents. They mostly were just like, well, let's just try to squeak by. And it worked, obviously, but not great. Probably not the most healthy lines of communication. If somebody wants to talk, you should definitely give them that.
Well, and remember, they're difficult because they are embarrassing. They can be controversial. So they are for parents too, not just for kids. So recognize that they are for you as well. But also keep in mind the fact that your kids are asking these questions and coming to it, these concerns are a sign that you have a good relationship with your kids. And that you have good communication. So you want to keep those lines of communication open. And so continuing those conversations.
It's kind difficult, but it's good.
Your credibility as a parent when you really do follow up.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so after the initial shock, maybe, what are some next steps that we can guide people through?
So you want to avoid being judgmental when you're talking to your kids or getting overly emotional. So, and if it's a really difficult conversation and you may want, you don't feel like you can handle it as a parent, it is okay to say, I need you to talk to someone else. You need to talk to your pediatrician, or I'd like for you to talk to a coach or a family friend and have someone else to talk to when your kids aren't around if it is a conversation that you don't feel like you can have. So after you gather your thoughts, if you're putting it off, make sure you set a time to talk that like we talked about earlier, that you follow up, that it's somewhere soon. And if you have some research to do, this is something I've done with my kids several times. It has been really helpful. They'll say, this is a topic I don't know a lot about, but I have some questions about it. And I'll ask them those questions, and I'll ask them, can you find out some information on these questions? And I'm also going to do some research on these. So that brings your kids in a couple different ways. We have to, as parents, teach them to problem solve. So when we're doing this, we're teaching our kids to problem solve. We're also teaching them how to find reliable information and to be critical thinkers. And so when we involve them in this research part of, of a topic. So if you're doing it, maybe invite your kid, say, your son or daughter, say, I have this question. Can you also look into that and see what you can find, and let's meet back together and talk about what you learned and what I learned. Yeah,
and you're creating really good self-advocates too, because they have these questions and then they're learning to then go out and find the answer and really problem solve for themselves. So that's a great.
And that's what you and I do, right?
Yes.
And I'm surprised sometimes, unfortunately, when my kids will say, I heard about this, and I'll say, well, where did you hear that? And the source that they are bringing me is not a reliable source. And so it's just a great way to teach them, where do you go to look when you need good information.
Especially now, in this day and age, we have, like you said earlier, there's so much information just constantly coming at us, and we scroll and we mindlessly scroll, and we're just seeing without seeing. We're seeing without really thinking too much about it. And so I think there is a problem of people just taking something that they're reading or hearing and not really digging deeper. So teaching kids to do that from a young age with something else will teach them to inevitably do that elsewhere. Or if it's, they'll say, I saw on social media in this quick little bit, and then there's no follow-up beyond that, to check to make sure that that story was credible or what the source was. There's so much clickbait on there, and you want them to look beyond that. Find out what's there. So a lot of these tips have been really helpful if your kid brings things to you and wants to have these discussions, which is great. But for some kids, that's probably not going to be the case, So how do we approach maybe kids who are less willing to talk, or maybe are less willing to bring things up in the first place? I hear that people say that my child doesn't have these conversations with me, or when I say to my son or daughter, how was your day, they don't want to talk to me. So some kids are just less likely to talk. I read a parenting book a couple years ago that said, pay attention that every child has a time when they are more likely to talk. And so I thought that was really interesting. I didn't really believe it, and so I was kind of paying attention to my own 4 daughters to see, is this true? And I was able to identify a time where each one of them is more likely to talk to me. So I would start there. Consider your kids and pay attention. Some of them are really chatty when they wake up in the morning. Some of them are, more so after school. I found that my 15-year-old, this was really kind of funny to me. She would migrate every night upstairs to her bedroom's on a different level than mine, and she would migrate every night upstairs to my bedroom and sit on my bathroom counter and brush her teeth.
And that was when she always wanted to talk to me. So there was always a toothbrush in her hanging out of her mouth. Weird time of the day, you know, we're all trying to get ready for bed and close up the house, but she wants to like tell me all about it. And I used to kind of get annoyed, like, that's gross, go brush your teeth in the bathroom. But then I realized this is her time.
This is the opportunity.
And so I would take advantages of those opportunities. And we actually had some really beautiful moments, you know, having some great conversations, again, with a toothbrush.
Sure.
You know, in between her and I. But
that's fine.
But yeah, pay attention. There is probably a time that your son or daughter is more likely to talk to you about these things. You know, also you could set aside a time, maybe carve out some one-on-one time. A lot of times one-on-one time is already built into our schedule. You know, you're driving your kids to school, you're driving them to soccer practice or whatever. You just like reach over and turn off the radio and you've created some one-on-one time. You know, I've never heard of a teenager throwing themselves out of a car to get away from their parents. So take advantage of those opportunities. But if it's not in your schedule, create some. You know, take them to breakfast or take them to do something, a hobby that you enjoy together, and create that one-on-one time so you can ask them open-ended questions. So avoid those yes or no questions. Open-ended questions to get them, you know, what do you think about? How do you feel about, you know, things like that? Tell me what's going on with school. Tell me about your friends so that you can have those conversations with them. That helps you just to stay connected too. If, you know, especially as teenagers, they do tend to withdraw more, you spend more time with their friends and they're on their phones in their rooms and things like that. So creating those opportunities can kind of, you know, help you to feel more connected.
So we've talked a lot about the actual conversations and how they're working and maybe how to approach them, but what are we getting from these conversations? What are the benefits that really you and your kids can have from having these conversations?
So it keeps your relationship close. You know, again, some of these are topics that I want my kids to come to me. I want to be the one to, you know, tell them, introduce this subject to them or this topic to them. And so it keeps that your relationship close. It also, you know, again, it helps you to just to know what they're thinking and what's going on in their lives. And also it can help you, you know, to share your opinions, your values, your beliefs with your kids when you have these opportunities. Also, you know, if you're going, you know what's going on in your child's life, it gives you the opportunity to help them manage those difficult situations when they come up, when they come to you and say, I have a problem here, or I'm having this struggle. If you have that relationship, they're more likely to come to you and help you, ask for your help in managing those difficult times.
That's great. So there are definitely going to be people when they're hearing us talk about this, especially like the next couple of topics that we're going into, whether you're talking about drugs or alcohol or sex or vaping, as we're going to talk about, that talking about these things, it's going to give your kids permission to engage in these activities. What's your response to that?
So research shows that is not true. So this isn't just my opinion. Research shows this is not true. For some reason, though, parents will believe, you know, if I have this conversation, it's giving them permission to participate in these, you know, have bad behavior, participate in things that I don't want them to be doing. But that's not true. If they are educated, they are more likely to be informed, and they can make better choices or assess a situation, or, you know, make better choices going in. So, you know, if you do feel like that this is something that your kids may do, if I talk to them about sex or I talk to them about drinking, that gives them permission to participate in those things before I think they're ready. It's not true, but, you know, let them know this is an opportunity also for you to give them what are the negative consequences for participating in that activity or for not participating in that activity. That gives you the opportunity to go over the consequences of that behavior with your son or daughter. You know, so for example, if you say to your son or daughter, I would prefer that you not participate in this, you know, harmful activity before this age. But if you do, come to me so that I can talk to you about how you can do it safely.
So it's really about giving them all of the information. It's not going to harm the outcome. You're really just enabling them to make a better decision.
Again, be a critical thinker, as you pointed out earlier.
Which is super important. So one of the notes that I see that you have here is remind them that they're not alone. So if they're bringing these conversations to you, it can feel maybe a little alienating or like a little bit like I'm having this thought or other people having this thought. So having these conversations does that for them. It gives them that sense of they're in this with everyone else, basically.
Well, sometimes kids will say, you know, the reason why I did this is because I'm the only one at my school that doesn't. I heard that from one of my kids for a long time. I'm the only one at my school that doesn't have a phone. That can't be true.
It's possibly not.
But you know, when it comes to these behaviors, they're not alone. You know, the ones I looked up were on vaping and sexting, because those are the two we're going to talk about specifically today. So according to the U.S. Surgeon General, there are 3 3.6 million youth in the United States that participate in vaping. That is about 1 in 5 high school students and 1 in 20 middle school students. That was a hard word.
That's a hard word.
That are currently using e-cigarettes. Okay. So 1 in 20, 1 in 5 for high school.
Right.
That sounds high. That's higher number that I want to hear as a health educator and as a parent. However,
it's not everyone. It's
not everyone.
Yeah.
So you need to remind your teenagers that's 4 out of 5 high school students that are not participating in this activity, and 19 out of 20 middle schoolers that are saying no when they're offered a vape pen.
Right.
Along with that is sexting. Same thing. 20% of teens say that they have sent a sext or received one, and again, that's 80% that have not participated in that behavior.
Right.
So remind your kids when you're saying no, it may feel like you're alone, but you in reality are not alone when you choose not to participate in these behaviors.
So with the time that we have left, we're going to break into a couple of, I think, the biggest topics that I think are on people's minds. So tell us about sexting. Let's talk about that conversation and maybe how that will go. So
sexting is sending explicit pictures, videos, messages, images through a smartphone or the internet. So that can include a picture where they're nude or nearly nude, any acts in those videos. Simulating those acts also would count as a sext. So when it comes to sexting, you don't want to wait for an incident to happen to your child or your child's friend before you talk about the consequences of sexting. You want to talk about this early, especially like I said, our kids are on their phones, on the internet, and once they can read and write, it increases the likelihood that they will be exposed to material on the internet that you don't want them to see.
Right.
So you want to talk to them about this early. And there's really 2 sides of this. There's sending and receiving.
Okay.
So when it comes to sending, you want to talk to your kids about the consequences of sending these pictures. Oftentimes they'll think I'm just sending it to this person, but once it leaves their phone or their possession, however, their email or whatever, it is no longer in their control. It can be easily shared. And this unfortunately is one area where the laws have not caught up with technology.
Okay.
So for example, in Ohio, if a picture is, the original sender is responsible for the image. So if it is sent to a friend and then it falls into the hands of someone who is underage, then it can be considered child pornography or passing on child pornography.
So there are actual legal implications to engaging in this activity.
Yes, and you look up, there's, I was reading a few news stories about some things that have happened at different high schools where they've broken up, big rings of pictures that have been circulating and surrounding, and there has been really sad consequences. We've had kids that have killed themselves because images have gotten out. There's been kids that have been suspended and expelled, and parents have had to pay legal fines that have been really high, to manage some of these problems that we've had with sexting. So as far as receiving, though, so just remind your kids, don't send anything out that you don't want. I mean, your grandma would be a good, that you don't want your grandma to see on your phone. Don't send it out.
Don't send it.
But then the other side of that is receiving, and we can't always control what we receive on our phones.
Right.
And so you want to talk to your kids and tell them the buck stops with you. If you receive this image on your phone, you're responsible for it. So you need to delete it. You need to show it to an adult. You need to be part of the solution and not the problem. And part of the problem would be passing it on.
Sure.
So it needs to stop with you. You need to show it to an adult or delete it and not pass it on, and ask them to be part of the solution.
So really just educating them on what it all means and all of the consequences, because it sounds like there are a ton.
And what it looks like.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the next one, I think, is, especially it's been in the news a lot lately, we're hearing so much about vaping. So talk to us about what is vaping.
Okay, so vaping is one that definitely when parents need to stop and make sure that they know the facts.
Right.
Unfortunately, when I'm talking to parents about vaping, they'll say things like, my kids are just doing it because they want the flavor. So they're just smoking the flavor. They're not getting any nicotine. But that is not true. The most popular brand out there that our teenagers are using is the Juul brand. And there are no products made by Juul brand that do not contain nicotine.
Okay.
So it's really important as parents that you get some facts. You understand when your kids say they're juuling or they're vaping, what it is that they're doing.
Right.
So get some facts. Unfortunately, facts don't always work when we're spewing them back to our teenagers. We know that that facts they don't always change behavior. I know I should eat, so many vegetables a day, and I don't do it every day anyway.
Right.
So having that knowledge doesn't necessarily always change their behavior. So we need those facts as parents, but just spewing them back to our kids, we can't expect them to give us the results that we want and to, keep them from that behavior.
Sure.
So ask your kids, what do you know about juuling? Do you know someone who juuls? What do you think about it? That's going to be two different conversations. If I ask my kid, what do you think about juuling? And they say, oh, it's awesome, everybody's doing it.
Right.
Or if they say, well, I think it's kind of, it could make me sick, or I worry about it, impacting my health, or I think it's gross or whatever. Those are two totally different conversations that I have to have. So starting with a question such as, what do you think about
finding out where they are.
Exactly. Giving them the opportunity to tell you, and recognize too that they may have already had some firsthand experience with these behaviors or have friends that do that. And so when they have their own observations and their own experiences, and they've arrived at some kind of conclusion. So get that, ask them what that is. So that you know which way that conversation will go. And then be patient and ready to listen.
Right. They're going to have an opinion probably about this, and don't dismiss it, but it's like how you kind of go about maybe redirecting. So the thing about these Juul or any of the vaping products really is that they were presented as a safe alternative to smoking, right? So a lot of people started to do them, and it really took some time for us to start to see that there were actually negative health effects, right? But we have started to see that a lot more in the news, that people are really starting to see deadly side effects to this. How would you go about, it does sound a little bit scary to be like, you could die. So like, how do we talk about the hazards of e-smoking with kids? Like, how do we go about pushing that across the table in like a safe and not scare tactic way?
So I would, first of all, at the beginning where we talked about bringing them in on that research may help them to do some critical thinking. They're reading some facts. Remind them, these choices have consequences. And again, maybe you're bringing them in to look at some of those consequences with you of what this behavior is. And then, share your own experiences, share your own values and morals when it comes to these things. Sometimes we feel like our teenagers don't care what we think, but adolescents do care what their parents think, and they do take fewer risks when we keep those lines of communication open. So this is an opportunity for you to say, this is a risk I hope you don't take. And these are the consequences of it, and kind of work through those consequences with them.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful. My nephew's 7 years old, and my sister's always engaged in, we've had smoking related deaths in our family, and so she's always been really respectful and but honest and upfront about the consequences of smoking when because they're curious, what are they doing? And she'll say, well, this is what they're doing, but now at 7, he's like, that will kill them. And I'm like, well, that's a little drastic, but being respectful, putting the facts across to them is a really, all right, great. So we have maybe just a little bit of time left. Are there any last thoughts or anything else you want to kind of get across to people? The last minute difficult conversations points.
So I would just say these conversations, they don't have to happen in a formal setting. They can happen in pieces here and there. Like I said, turning down the radio on the car, asking your kids, what do you think about this? Or I heard this story, what are your thoughts? Taking advantage of those little opportunities day to day and have those conversations in pieces. I mean, there will be times your kids come to you, have to sit down and actually handle one of these topics, but in other ways you can share your thoughts and your opinions and your feelings on these just in pieces over here and there. So don't feel pressure to sit down and have this great life-changing conversation with your teenager once a month or twice a year or whatever.
Just be flexible, be open. All right.
Take those opportunities as they present themselves.
Yeah, that's great advice. Well, thank you so much. This is such good information. I'm sure we'll have you back to discuss it more on another edition. But that is it for us today on Healthy Living Resources. We'll see you next month.